She had no idea that the woman he was about to order to get him coffee was the $8 billion CEO who was literally buying his company, while he hurled racist insults at her. When Vanessa Clark walked into her own bank's exclusive lounge dressed in simple clothes, tech CEO Edward Pierce took one look and decided she didn't belong there. But what started as workplace discrimination quickly escalated when he snapped his fingers at her and demanded she serve him like hired help, then launched into explicit racist language when she ignored him. The situation exploded when Edward physically stole her tablet and threatened to destroy it, not knowing he was stealing property from the woman who was about to become his boss. Because at the exact moment security was called to remove her, Vanessa's phone rang with news that would change everything. The acquisition of Pierce Tech is finalized. You are now the majority owner. What happened next when this racist discovered he had just discriminated against his new boss will restore your faith that justice can triumph when it's backed by real corporate power. This is the story of how one woman transformed workplace discrimination into a multi-million-dollar lesson that would revolutionize how an entire industry treats people. Stay until the end to see how she turned his prejudice into a permanent training program that will protect thousands of future employees from experiencing the same humiliation. She had no idea that in the next 30 minutes, the woman sitting quietly in the corner of that exclusive private lounge would acquire a multi-million-dollar tech company for the sole purpose of firing the man who was about to humiliate her. Vanessa Clark adjusted her simple sweater and faded jeans as she settled into the plush leather chair at Summit Wealth Bank's most elite branch, a location so exclusive that it required a minimum account balance of $50 million just to walk through the doors. To anyone observing, Vanessa looked like she didn't belong in this temple of wealth and power. Her understated appearance was a deliberate choice, but not for the reasons people might assume. As the CEO and founder of Summit Enterprises, a business conglomerate worth over $8 billion, Vanessa owned the very bank she was sitting in. Every marble tile beneath her feet, every crystal chandelier above her head, every security camera recording the room belonged to her empire. But today wasn't about flaunting her wealth or commanding respect through expensive clothes and flashy jewelry. Today was about something far more important to Vanessa's business philosophy. She believed that true character revealed itself when people thought no one important was watching, and the most accurate measure of an organization's values could only be discovered by experiencing it as an ordinary customer. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, Vanessa had stood in this same private lounge during the bank's acquisition ceremony, surrounded by financial reporters and industry executives, announcing that Summit Wealth would become the flagship institution of her growing empire. She had personally designed the client experience protocols, insisting that every person who entered their doors would be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their appearance or background. Now dressed down and anonymous, she was conducting the most important test of whether her own employees actually followed the values she had spent millions of dollars implementing. The multi-million-dollar acquisition she was here to finalize wasn't just another business deal. It was the culmination of months of strategic planning to acquire Pierce Tech, an artificial intelligence company that would complete her technology portfolio. Vanessa pulled out her tablet, reviewing the final wire transfer details that would make her the majority shareholder of Edward Pierce's company. The acquisition had been structured as a friendly buyout, with Pierce believing he was negotiating with anonymous investors through intermediaries. He had no idea that the woman who would soon control his entire professional future was sitting less than 50 feet away from his own office building.
The quiet elegance of the private lounge masked the electronic sophistication that Vanessa had built into every aspect of her banking operations. Invisible cameras captured every interaction for quality assurance. Artificial intelligence systems monitored customer satisfaction in real time. And digital protocols ensured that discriminatory behavior would be immediately flagged and addressed. as she waited for Robert Matthews, the bank's newest manager, to assist with her transaction. Vanessa reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Growing up as a black woman in corporate America, she had faced countless situations where people underestimated her intelligence, questioned her qualifications, and dismissed her ideas based solely on their assumptions about who she was supposed to be. But instead of letting those experiences embitter her, Vanessa had channeled them into building something extraordinary. Every company she acquired, every policy she implemented, every leader she hired was chosen with the deliberate intention of creating spaces where talent and character mattered more than appearance or background. The acquisition documents on her tablet represented more than just a business transaction. They were about to become the instrument of the most elegant corporate justice ever delivered, though the man who would receive that justice had no idea what was coming. If you believe that true character shows when people think no one important is watching, hit that like button right now. Share in the comments a time when you witnessed someone's real values when they thought it didn't matter. And don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next will prove that the most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger, it's ownership.
But at the exact moment Vanessa was reviewing the final details of what would become the most expensive lesson in respect ever taught, the peaceful atmosphere of her own private lounge was shattered by a voice that would soon cost its owner everything he had spent years building. The heavy glass doors burst open with unnecessary force as Edward Pierce stormed into the exclusive space like he owned not just the room, but everyone in it. Edward Pierce was everything Vanessa had learned to recognize and despise in her years climbing the corporate ladder. At 42, he had built Pierce Tech into a moderately successful artificial intelligence company, but more importantly to him, he had cultivated a reputation as one of the most demanding and difficult clients in the banking industry. His 8-figure accounts gave him the kind of access that most people could only dream of, and he wielded that financial power like a weapon against anyone he deemed beneath his notice. The moment Edward's eyes swept the lounge and landed on Vanessa, his expression shifted from casual arrogance to something far more ugly and personal. Here was a black woman in simple clothes, sitting in his private sanctuary, occupying space that he believed should be reserved for people who looked like him and shared his background. The sight of her triggered every prejudice and assumption that had been festering in his mind for years. "Are they letting just anyone in here now?" Edward sneered, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt that came from someone who had never been challenged about his behavior. "This lounge is for people who build things, not for people who need handouts." Vanessa looked up from her tablet, her expression remaining perfectly calm despite the fire that was beginning to build in her chest. She had heard variations of these words countless times before, in boardrooms and conference halls, from men who assumed that her presence in their spaces was either a mistake or a charity case. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just another target of discrimination. This time, she was the woman who would decide this man's professional fate within the hour. Edward, encouraged by her silence and interpreting it as submission, decided to escalate his performance of dominance. He snapped his fingers at her with the casual cruelty of someone who had never considered that his actions might have consequences. "Sweetheart, get me a coffee, and make it quick. I have real business to conduct here." The audacity of the command hung in the air like poison. Here was a man so consumed by his own sense of superiority that he had looked at a fellow bank client and immediately assumed she was service staff. More than that, he had assumed she was service staff who existed solely for his convenience and pleasure. The snap of his fingers wasn't just rude, it was dehumanizing, reducing Vanessa to nothing more than an object designed to fulfill his needs. What Edward didn't realize was that every word he spoke was being recorded by the very security systems that Vanessa had personally commissioned when she acquired the bank. What he couldn't imagine was that the woman he was treating like hired help had the power to buy and sell companies like his as easily as ordering lunch. What he would never have guessed was that his casual cruelty was about to trigger a chain of events that would transform him from business owner to unemployed cautionary tale in less time than it takes to brew the coffee he was demanding. Vanessa's fingers moved subtly across her tablet, not to comply with his demands, but to send a discreet message to her executive assistant. The acquisition timeline was about to be accelerated, and Edward Pierce was about to learn that there are consequences for treating people like they don't matter. But first, he was going to reveal just how deep his prejudice ran, giving Vanessa all the evidence she would need to justify what came next. The transformation from successful businessman to corporate pariah was about to begin, and Edward Pierce was orchestrating his own destruction with every contemptuous word that came out of his mouth.
What happened next would transform Edward's casual arrogance into something far more sinister and legally dangerous, proving that some people's prejudice runs so deep that silence becomes an invitation for them to reveal their true character. When Vanessa calmly ignored his demand for coffee and continued reviewing her tablet with the composed dignity of someone who had faced such behavior countless times before, Edward's fragile ego couldn't handle the perceived disrespect of being dismissed by someone he considered beneath him. Vanessa's silence wasn't submission, it was strategic. Every second that Edward continued talking was another piece of evidence being captured by the sophisticated recording systems she had installed throughout the bank. Every word he spoke was being automatically transcribed and stored in digital files that would soon become part of the most expensive corporate acquisition in her company's history. She knew from experience that men like Edward rarely stopped at simple rudeness when their authority was challenged, and she was prepared to let him expose himself completely. "What's the matter?" Edward snarled, his voice rising with the kind of rage that came from someone who had never been ignored by people he considered his inferiors. "Don't speak English, or are you too busy plotting how to scam the system like the rest of your kind?" The words hit the air like a physical slap, transforming the elegant atmosphere of the private lounge into something ugly and toxic. Edward had just crossed the line from general rudeness into explicit racism, revealing the depth of prejudice that lurked beneath his expensive suit and professional facade. This wasn't just about bad manners or entitlement anymore. This was about systematic dehumanization based on race, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed his wealth would protect him from any consequences. But Edward wasn't finished exposing himself. The taste of his own venom seemed to embolden him, and he continued his assault with the kind of cruel precision that suggested this wasn't his first time expressing such thoughts. "People like you are always looking for an easy payday, aren't you? Always trying to find some angle, some way to get something for nothing." Just as his racist tirade was reaching its peak, the lounge doors opened to admit Robert Matthews, the bank's newest manager, a man who had been hired specifically because of his reputation for treating every client with equal respect regardless of their background. Robert was young, idealistic, and genuinely committed to the values that Vanessa had tried to instill throughout her organization. His timing couldn't have been more perfect, as he walked directly into a situation that would test everything he claimed to believe about customer service and human dignity. Edward immediately seized upon Robert's arrival as an opportunity to solidify his position of dominance and force the bank to choose sides between a wealthy client and someone he assumed was an intruder. His voice carried the threat of financial retaliation as he pointed directly at Vanessa with unconcealed disgust. "Robert, what is this doing in my lounge?" Edward demanded, his tone making it clear that he didn't consider Vanessa worthy of being referred to as a person. "This is supposed to be an exclusive space for serious clients, not a charity case trying to work some kind of angle. Get her out of here before I decide to move my company's 8-figure accounts to a bank that actually values its real clients." The threat was deliberate and calculated. Edward was using his financial leverage to force the bank to participate in his discrimination, essentially demanding that they choose between his money and their stated values. He believed that his 8-figure accounts gave him the power to dictate who belonged in the private lounge and who should be removed, regardless of their actual client status or rights. What Edward didn't realize was that he had just threatened to remove his own future boss from her own bank, using language so explicitly racist and discriminatory that it would soon be used as evidence in corporate training programs about what not to do. The man who thought he was flexing his financial muscle was actually providing the perfect justification for his own professional destruction, one recorded word at a time. The trap was set, the evidence was being gathered, and Edward Pierce was digging his own corporate grave with every prejudiced syllable that escaped his mouth.
But just when it seemed like Edward's wealth and arrogance would steamroll over basic human decency, something extraordinary happened that would prove not everyone can be bought or intimidated into participating in discrimination. Robert Matthews looked directly at Edward Pierce, then at Vanessa, and in that moment made a decision that would define not just his career, but his character as a human being. "Sir," Robert said, his voice steady and professional despite the obvious tension crackling through the air, "she is a client and has every right to be here. I'm going to need you to treat all our clients with respect, regardless of their appearance or background." The words landed like a bomb in the pristine lounge. Robert had just done something that Edward clearly wasn't expecting. He had chosen integrity over intimidation, principles over profit. This young manager who could have easily sided with the client threatening to move 8-figure accounts had instead stood up for what was right, even though he had no idea he was defending the woman who actually owned the entire bank. Edward's face flushed red with a mixture of shock and rage. He wasn't used to being challenged by bank employees, especially not by someone he considered a subordinate who should be grateful for his business. "Are you seriously going to side with her over me?" Edward sputtered, his voice rising to a level that was attracting attention from other areas of the bank. "Do you have any idea how much money I've invested with this institution? I could have you fired with a single phone call." But Robert didn't back down. If anything, Edward's threats only seemed to strengthen his resolve. "Mr. Pierce, I understand you're an important client, but threatening my job won't change the fact that every person in this lounge deserves to be treated with basic respect. That's not negotiable." What none of them realized was that this entire confrontation was being witnessed and recorded by Maria Santos, another client who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the lounge, initially minding her own business. Maria had pulled out her phone the moment Edward's language turned explicitly racist, and now she was capturing every word, every gesture, every moment of this extraordinary display of both prejudice and principle. Her hands were slightly shaking as she realized she was documenting what might become one of the most important examples of workplace discrimination ever caught on camera. Meanwhile, Vanessa had been conducting her own form of evidence gathering, with calm, deliberate movements that betrayed none of the strategic planning happening in her mind. She had been typing messages on her tablet throughout Edward's entire tirade. Her fingers moved across the screen with the precision of someone who had spent years orchestrating complex business maneuvers, and now she was about to execute the most satisfying corporate strategy of her career. The message she sent to her executive assistant, Carla, was brief but devastating in its implications. Initiate code Onyx, record everything, and expedite the Pierce Tech acquisition. Code Onyx wasn't just a corporate protocol, it was Vanessa's personal system for documenting and responding to discrimination within her business empire. The moment she activated it, sophisticated recording systems throughout the bank shifted into high-resolution mode. Artificial intelligence programs began analyzing speech patterns for evidence of bias, and legal teams were automatically notified to prepare discrimination documentation. But most importantly, the acquisition timeline for Pierce Tech was being accelerated from next week to within the hour. Edward had no idea that his racist outburst had just triggered a corporate response system designed specifically to deal with people like him. He didn't know that every word he had spoken was being processed by legal software that would soon be used to justify his termination. He couldn't imagine that the woman he was trying to humiliate had the power to acquire his entire company as easily as ordering dinner. The evidence was mounting, the allies were standing firm, and the technology was capturing everything. Edward Pierce thought he was flexing his power, but he was actually providing all the justification needed for his own professional execution. The trap wasn't just set anymore, it was about to snap shut with devastating precision. If you're as inspired as I am by Robert's courage to stand up for what's right even when threatened by wealth and power, smash that like button to show your support for people who choose integrity over intimidation. Comment below with fire emojis if you believe that no amount of money should buy the right to dehumanize another person. And hit subscribe, because what Vanessa is about to do to this racist will restore your faith that justice can triumph over prejudice when it's backed by real power.
What followed next would push this already explosive confrontation past the point of no return, transforming workplace discrimination into potential criminal assault and providing Vanessa with all the evidence she would need to justify the corporate nuclear option she was about to deploy. Edward Pierce, faced with the unprecedented experience of a bank employee refusing to bow to his financial threats, was about to make a series of decisions that would destroy not just his career, but potentially land him in federal prison. The sight of Robert standing firm despite his threats had triggered something primal and dangerous in Edward's psyche. Throughout his entire adult life, he had used his wealth as a weapon to get his way, to silence opposition, and to force people to submit to his will. When that weapon failed him for the first time, when a young bank manager chose principles over profit, Edward's carefully constructed facade of civilized behavior began to crumble, revealing the violent tendencies that had always lurked beneath his expensive suits and corporate credentials. "You know what?" Edward snarled, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that somehow felt more dangerous than his previous shouting. "If the bank won't handle this situation properly, then I'll handle it myself." The shift in his tone sent alarm bells ringing throughout the lounge. This wasn't just angry customer behavior anymore. This was the sound of someone preparing to cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Maria's hands tightened around her phone as she continued recording, instinctively understanding that she was about to capture something that would make national headlines. Robert tensed, his training in de-escalation techniques warring with his growing realization that this situation was spiraling beyond anything he had been prepared to handle. But it was Vanessa who became the focal point of Edward's escalating rage. In his twisted logic, she was the source of his humiliation, the reason why his authority was being questioned, the catalyst for his loss of control. With deliberate, menacing steps, Edward moved toward her chair, his intention clear to everyone in the room. He was about to physically intimidate or potentially assault a woman whose only crime was existing in a space he believed belonged exclusively to people like him. "Let's see what's so important on that little tablet of yours," Edward said, his voice carrying the unmistakable threat of violence. "What's on there? Your welfare application? Some kind of scam you're running?" Without warning, without permission, without any regard for basic human decency or legal boundaries, Edward reached out and snatched Vanessa's tablet from her hands. The action was so sudden, so brazenly criminal, that for a moment the entire lounge fell into stunned silence. He had just committed theft in front of multiple witnesses in a building filled with security cameras while being recorded on a client's phone. But Edward wasn't finished. His eyes scanned the tablet screen with the malicious glee of someone who believed he was about to expose some kind of fraud or deception. What he saw instead made his face contort with confusion and rage. The screen displayed corporate acquisition documents, financial transfers in the millions of dollars, and legal paperwork that suggested the woman he had been trying to humiliate was involved in business deals that dwarfed his own company's entire valuation.
"What is this?" Edward demanded, his voice cracking with the first hint of uncertainty he had shown since entering the lounge. The documents on the screen didn't match his assumptions about who Vanessa was supposed to be, and the cognitive dissonance was beginning to crack his confidence. In his frustration and confusion, Edward raised the tablet above his head, clearly intending to destroy it in a fit of rage. The gesture was so violent, so completely divorced from rational behavior, that it crossed every possible line, from discrimination into criminal destruction of property and potential assault. But that's when Robert Matthews proved that his earlier stand for principle wasn't just empty words. With reflexes that surprised everyone, including himself, Robert stepped directly between Edward and Vanessa, placing his own body as a barrier against potential violence. "Sir, if you touch her or damage her property, I will have security remove you from this building immediately," Robert said, his voice steady despite the obvious danger he was placing himself in. "I don't care how much money you have or who you think you are. You do not get to assault people in my bank." The confrontation had reached its absolute peak. Edward Pierce, clutching a stolen tablet above his head like a weapon, found himself face to face with a bank manager who was willing to risk his own safety to protect a client. The irony was staggering. A man who had built his entire identity around his financial superiority was being physically challenged by someone who made a fraction of his annual income but possessed infinitely more courage and integrity. "You'd remove me?" he laughed, but the sound was hollow and desperate rather than confident. "You'd remove your biggest client for her? Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? Do you understand that I could buy and sell people like you?" What Edward didn't realize was that his threats had just been recorded and transmitted in real time to legal teams who were already preparing criminal charges for theft, destruction of property, and assault. What he couldn't imagine was that the woman whose tablet he had stolen was at that very moment becoming the majority owner of his company through an accelerated acquisition that would make her his boss within minutes. The point of no return hadn't just been reached, it had been obliterated. Edward Pierce had provided so much evidence of criminal behavior that his destruction was now not just justified, but inevitable. The only question remaining was whether he would be led away in handcuffs or simply escorted out as a disgraced former CEO. But either way, his reign of entitled cruelty was about to end forever.
But at the exact moment Edward Pierce was about to shove Robert aside and destroy what he believed was evidence of some elaborate scam, the universe delivered a dose of poetic justice so perfect that it would be talked about in business schools for decades to come. The soft chime of Vanessa's phone cut through the tension like a sword, and when she calmly reached into her pocket to answer it, nobody in that room could have anticipated that they were about to witness the most devastating corporate power shift in modern business history. The timing was so flawless, it seemed orchestrated by fate itself. While Edward stood frozen with Vanessa's tablet raised above his head like a weapon, while Robert positioned himself as a human shield between violence and innocence, while Maria's phone captured every second of what appeared to be an imminent assault, Vanessa's executive assistant was calling with news that would transform this entire confrontation from a discrimination incident into the most expensive lesson in respect ever delivered. "Ma'am, I have the update you requested," came the crisp, professional voice of Carla Reynolds through the phone's speaker, which Vanessa had deliberately activated so everyone in the room could hear. "Code Onyx is complete. The board has approved the final wire transfer. The acquisition of Pierce Tech is finalized as of 30 seconds ago." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, but Edward was still too consumed with rage to fully process their meaning. He was still focused on the tablet in his hands, still convinced that he was about to expose some kind of fraud, still operating under the assumption that he held all the power in the situation. But Carla wasn't finished delivering the news that would destroy Edward's entire world. "Congratulations, ma'am. You are now the majority shareholder and controlling owner of Pierce Tech Corporation. All documentation has been filed with the SEC, and Mr. Pierce's employment status is now subject to your direct authority." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to vacuum all sound from the room. Edward's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious: confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally a dawning realization that his entire professional life had just been placed in the hands of the woman he had spent the last 20 minutes systematically humiliating and threatening. Vanessa stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled, the tablet still clutched in Edward's suddenly trembling hands. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had just acquired the power to end careers with a single decision. "You were right about one thing, Edward," her voice cutting through the silence with surgical precision. "This lounge isn't for people who need handouts. It's for owners." She paused, allowing the full weight of revelation to settle over the room like a shroud. "And as of 30 seconds ago, I own your company. I own your salary. I own your stock options. I own your office, your parking space, and your executive bathroom." The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. Edward Pierce, who had entered this lounge as a successful CEO commanding 8-figure accounts, was now standing before his new boss while holding stolen property and having just threatened to assault her in front of multiple witnesses. The irony was so complete, so perfectly circular, that it seemed designed by a cosmic sense of justice. "That's impossible," Edward whispered, his voice barely audible as his brain struggled to process what he was hearing. "The acquisition wasn't supposed to close until next week. My lawyer said we had time to review the final terms."
Vanessa's smile was cold and sharp as a winter morning. "I expedited the timeline when you decided to demonstrate exactly why Pierce Tech needed new leadership. Turns out that stealing property from your future boss and threatening her with violence is excellent justification for immediate corporate restructuring." The tablet in Edward's hands suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Everything he was holding, everything he was touching, everything he had threatened to destroy belonged to the woman he had been trying to humiliate. The acquisition documents he had dismissed as fraudulent were actually the legal instruments of his own professional execution. "But more than that, Edward," Vanessa continued, her voice gaining strength as she fully embraced her position of absolute authority. "You need to understand what you've really accomplished here today. You haven't just insulted a bank customer. You haven't just threatened a fellow client. You've committed multiple crimes in front of witnesses against the person who now controls every aspect of your professional future." Robert stood transfixed, still positioned between them, but no longer needed as a physical barrier. The power dynamics in the room had shifted so completely that Edward no longer posed a threat to anyone except himself. Maria continued recording, realizing that she was documenting what might be the most spectacular corporate comeuppance ever captured on camera. "I am Vanessa Clark," she announced, her voice now carrying the full weight of $8 billion in corporate authority. "I am the founder and CEO of Summit Enterprises. I own this bank. I own the building you're standing in. And as of this moment, I own you." The revelation was complete, but the reckoning had only just begun. Edward Pierce had wanted to know who belonged in that exclusive lounge, and now he had his answer. The woman who owned everything he had ever worked to achieve, including his own company and his own future.
What followed was the most swift and devastating delivery of corporate justice ever witnessed in the financial industry.
proving that when discrimination is exposed at the highest levels of business power, consequences can be both immediate and life-altering in ways that reshape entire careers within minutes. The moment Vanessa's identity was revealed, Edward Pierce's face underwent a transformation that would have been fascinating to psychologists studying the complete collapse of entitled arrogance under the weight of inescapable reality. Edward's mouth opened and closed repeatedly, like a fish gasping for air on dry land, as his brain struggled to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. The confident, aggressive man who had stormed into the lounge 20 minutes earlier was nowhere to be found, replaced by someone who looked like he was witnessing his own professional funeral in real time. His hands, still clutching Vanessa's tablet, began to shake uncontrollably as the full implications of his situation crashed over him like a tsunami of corporate consequences. "No, no, this can't be right," Edward stammered, his voice cracking with desperation as he tried to find some escape from the trap he had built for himself. "The deal wasn't supposed to close until next week. My lawyers, they said we had time to review the final terms. They assured me that the anonymous buyers were still conducting due diligence." Vanessa's response was delivered with the cold precision of someone who had spent years orchestrating complex business strategies and now had the satisfaction of watching a particularly elegant plan reach its perfect conclusion. "Your lawyers were operating with outdated information, Edward. When Code Onyx was activated 30 minutes ago, it triggered emergency acquisition protocols that allowed us to bypass the standard waiting periods." She paused, allowing the weight of his situation to fully settle in his mind before delivering the next blow. "You see, Code Onyx isn't just a recording system. It's a comprehensive corporate response protocol designed specifically to deal with discrimination, harassment, and criminal behavior involving Summit Enterprises properties or personnel. When serious violations are detected, it authorizes immediate business actions to protect our interests and ensure accountability." The sophistication of the system that had ensnared him was staggering. Edward was beginning to realize that his racist outburst and criminal behavior hadn't just been recorded for potential future consequences. They had triggered an automated corporate machine designed to deliver immediate and devastating retribution. Every word he had spoken, every threat he had made, every law he had broken had been processed by artificial intelligence systems that had calculated the most appropriate business response and executed it in real time. "But the acquisition price," Edward whispered, grasping for any detail that might offer him hope of escape. "The negotiations weren't finalized. The board hadn't approved the final terms." Vanessa's smile was sharp enough to cut Diamond. "Oh, but they had, Edward. The board approved the acquisition at market value plus a 20% premium. Your shareholders were quite pleased with the offer, especially when our legal team provided them with advance notice of the discrimination and criminal behavior that was about to make their CEO a liability."
The revelation hit Edward like a physical blow. Not only had he lost control of his company, but his own shareholders had been informed of his behavior before he even knew he was being acquired. His board of directors had essentially sold him out, trading his leadership for Vanessa's premium offer and the protection it provided from the legal consequences of his actions. "Now, as your new boss," Vanessa continued, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who literally owned every aspect of Edward's professional existence, "let me give you your first and last directive as an employee of Summit Enterprises. You will immediately return my property, apologize to me personally for your racist language and criminal behavior, apologize to Robert for threatening his safety, and apologize to every person in this room for subjecting them to your disgusting display of prejudice."
Edward stood frozen, the tablet still in his trembling hands, as the full scope of his humiliation became clear. He was about to be forced to apologize to the woman he had spent 20 minutes dehumanizing, and he was going to have to do it as her employee, not as an equal. The power dynamic had been so completely reversed that he was now in the position of someone begging for mercy from the person he had tried to destroy. "And after you've completed those apologies," Vanessa added, her tone becoming even more glacial, "you will tender your immediate resignation from Pierce Tech Corporation. My security team is already on their way to your office to escort you out and ensure that you don't attempt to damage company property or steal confidential information on your way out." The speed and thoroughness of the corporate takeover was breathtaking. While Edward had been busy making racist comments and threatening violence in the bank lounge, Vanessa's team had been executing a complete corporate acquisition, notifying shareholders, filing SEC paperwork, and dispatching security teams to secure his former company. Every aspect of his professional life was being systematically dismantled while he stood helplessly clutching stolen property in front of multiple witnesses. "My security clearance," Edward said weakly, as if suddenly remembering that his access to his own company was now controlled by the woman he had tried to humiliate. "My office, my files, my personal belongings will be reviewed by our legal team and returned to you if they don't constitute company property. Of course, any items that could be considered evidence in potential criminal proceedings will be held until those matters are resolved." The reference to criminal proceedings sent another wave of terror through Edward's already shattered composure. He was beginning to realize that losing his job might be the least of his problems. The theft, the threats of violence, the criminal assault he had nearly committed, all of it had been recorded and was now in the hands of someone with the resources and motivation to pursue full legal consequences. Robert, who had been standing transfixed throughout this entire exchange, finally found his voice. "Ma'am, I had no idea who you were. I couldn't let him treat you that way." Vanessa turned to him with the first genuine warmth she had shown since the confrontation began. "Robert, your actions today demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and integrity that Summit Enterprises values. When someone with millions of dollars in accounts threatened to destroy your career unless you participated in discrimination, you chose to do what was right instead of what was profitable. That kind of moral courage is rare and valuable." The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Robert, who had risked his job to protect a stranger from discrimination, was being praised and recognized, while Edward, who had used his wealth as a weapon against dignity and respect, was being systematically stripped of everything he had spent years building. The justice wasn't just swift, it was perfectly calibrated to demonstrate that no amount of money or corporate power could protect someone from the consequences of treating other human beings as less than worthy of basic respect.
But what happened next proved that true justice isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation that creates lasting change for entire industries and countless future victims of discrimination. As Edward Pierce stumbled through his humiliated apologies and reluctantly handed back the stolen tablet with trembling fingers, Vanessa Clark made a decision that would elevate this story from personal revenge to a masterclass in using corporate power to reshape business culture across America. Instead of simply watching Edward slink away in disgrace, Vanessa chose to demonstrate the kind of leadership that transforms moments of ugliness into opportunities for systemic change. She had the power to destroy Edward completely, to press criminal charges, to make him a cautionary tale whispered about in corporate boardrooms for decades to come. But what she did instead showed a sophistication of justice that went far beyond simple retribution. "Edward," Vanessa said, her voice still carrying absolute authority, but now tinged with something that might have been educational rather than purely punitive, "I'm not having you arrested today, not because you don't deserve it, but because you're going to serve a more valuable purpose as a living example of what happens when prejudice meets accountability." The decision sent ripples of surprise through the room. Maria lowered her phone slightly, wondering if she had misheard. Robert's eyebrows raised in confusion. Even Edward looked up with a desperate hope that maybe his nightmare was about to end with some kind of merciful reprieve. But Vanessa wasn't finished explaining her strategy. "You see, firing you and pressing charges would remove you from the conversation, but keeping you as the centerpiece of a corporate transformation program will ensure that your behavior serves a purpose beyond your own humiliation." What she announced next would make headlines in business journals and potentially revolutionize how companies address discrimination and harassment. "As the new owner of Pierce Tech, I'm implementing an immediate company-wide program called Dignity in Business. Every employee, from entry-level staff to senior management, will undergo comprehensive training on respect, inclusion, and the real-world consequences of discriminatory behavior." The scope of her vision was staggering, but she wasn't finished. "And Edward, you're going to be the star of our first training module. The footage of your behavior today, captured by our security systems and Maria's phone, will become the primary case study for what not to do in a professional environment." Edward's face went ashen as he realized that his racist outburst and criminal behavior would be preserved forever as corporate education material, shown to thousands of employees as an example of prejudice and poor judgment. His humiliation wouldn't end when he left the building. It would be institutionalized as a teaching tool. Furthermore, Vanessa continued, her announcement gaining momentum as she outlined her broader vision, Pierce Tech's transformation will become a model for the entire industry. We're partnering with business schools, corporate consulting firms, and civil rights organizations to develop comprehensive programs that other companies can implement. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Vanessa addressed Robert directly, recognizing the courage he had shown in standing up to financial pressure and threats to his career. "Robert, your integrity today demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership Summit Enterprises needs. I'm promoting you to regional manager effective immediately, with oversight of our new corporate culture initiatives." The promotion was more than just recognition. It was a statement that moral courage would be rewarded while prejudice would be systematically eliminated. Robert had risked his job to protect a stranger from discrimination, and now he was being elevated to help transform an entire corporation's approach to dignity and respect.
As Vanessa concluded her announcements, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a simple business transaction in an exclusive bank lounge had evolved into a comprehensive corporate response to discrimination that would impact thousands of employees and potentially influence industry-wide practices. "Let this be clear to everyone in the business community," Vanessa said, her voice carrying the weight of $8 billion in corporate authority. "Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's a business liability that will be met with immediate and comprehensive consequences. We're not just changing one company, we're changing how business treats people." Edward Pierce had wanted to know who belonged in that exclusive lounge. Now he had his answer. People who understood that true power comes not from the ability to diminish others, but from the capacity to elevate entire communities and transform systematic problems into opportunities for growth and justice. The ultimate power Vanessa had demonstrated wasn't just firing someone for their prejudice, it was taking over their entire legacy and rebuilding it on a foundation of respect, turning a moment of ugly discrimination into a powerful force for positive change that would protect countless future victims from experiencing similar treatment.
Vanessa Clark's story reveals a fundamental truth about power that every person facing discrimination needs to understand. The most effective response to prejudice isn't just surviving it, it's systematically dismantling the structures that allow it to flourish. What makes this story extraordinary isn't just that Edward got his comeuppance, but how Vanessa transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a corporate revolution that will protect thousands of people from experiencing similar treatment. From an insider's perspective, this story exposes something that business leaders rarely admit publicly. Discrimination in professional settings isn't just about individual bad actors. It's about systems that reward prejudice and protect perpetrators. Edward Pierce felt comfortable hurling racist insults and committing theft because he believed his wealth made him untouchable. Vanessa's response proved that real power isn't about having money to threaten people with, but having the resources and strategic vision to create permanent change that makes such behavior professionally suicidal. The lesson here transcends corporate boardrooms and speaks to anyone who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or dehumanized based on their appearance. When you have the opportunity to respond to discrimination, you have a choice. You can seek individual revenge, or you can build systems that prevent others from experiencing what you endured. Vanessa chose transformation over retaliation, education over destruction, and permanent change over temporary satisfaction. What Vanessa accomplished in that bank lounge will echo through the business world for decades. But more importantly, she demonstrated that the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger or legal action, though both have their place. It's using whatever power you have, whether that's economic influence, social media platforms, or simply the courage to speak up like Robert did, to create environments where discrimination becomes impossible rather than just punishable. Edward Pierce learned that wealth without character is just expensive emptiness. But the real victory belongs to every future employee who will benefit from the Dignity in Business program, every person who will be protected by the systems Vanessa implemented, and every individual who will be inspired to use their own power to create positive change rather than perpetuate harm. The ultimate message is clear. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's strategically stupid. In a world where your victims might literally own you tomorrow, treating people with dignity isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smartest business decision you can make. If this story of strategic justice and corporate transformation inspired you to think differently about how power should be used, smash that like button to support content that shows real solutions to discrimination. Drop a comment below sharing how you've used whatever power you have to stand up against prejudice, or tell us what you would have done in Vanessa's position. And if you believe that the best response to hatred is building systems that make it impossible for others to experience the same pain, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because we're bringing you more incredible stories of people who turn their worst moments into opportunities to change the world. The next story might be even more shocking than this one, and you definitely don't want to miss how ordinary people are using extraordinary strategies to create justice in a world that desperately needs it.